afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to NPHA's 2020 Annual Conference. We're excited to be joined by Abby Baker and Kristen King from the University of New Hampshire for our last session for today. And they will be speaking with us about job crafting. A couple announcements. If you want to ask questions, please use the Ask feature on the conference website, or if you're in the app. And please remember to provide feedback using the feedback button on the session page. And with that, I would love to introduce Kristen King and Abby Baker. Kristen is a clinical research assistant and a research and program evaluation manager at the University of New Hampshire. And Abby Baker is a graduate research assistant also with the University of New Hampshire. So thank you both for being here this afternoon, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Heather. My name is Abby, and thanks for that great introduction. The title of our presentation today is The Development and Efficacy of Job Crafting, a coaching-based intervention strategy to improve work-related outcomes of individuals with disabilities. Okay. So for some background information, as most of us working adults are aware, work is a huge part of our lives, right? Work can lead to a sense of identity, a sense of self-fulfillment, sometimes even self-development. There's certainly a social aspect to work. And of course, there's that financial element as well of making a livelihood, right? But a lot of stress and tension can arise when someone's skills or abilities do not match up with what the job demands that they are, the position that they're at. And that can lead to job dissatisfaction, sort of a loss of self-esteem, and even loss of motivation in working towards that company or in that organization. For folks with disabilities, barriers in the workplace are even greater. So there can be communication barriers, accommodation barriers, there can be functional barriers, communication, social, all sorts of barriers that impacts one's experience at work. And historically, programs and policies have really focused on helping people with disabilities get a job, gain employment. But recently, there's been a bit more of a shift towards job retention and job satisfaction. So this is kind of the backdrop of our project here and the intervention that we tested, which is really helping that the experience that people are having at work, not just in terms of getting a job, but also being happy at the position that you're at, and kind of taking a more self-empowered approach to career self-management. So the concept of job crafting is one that has existed in the world for quite a while, particularly the corporate sphere. And what it is a process of redesigning and sort of reconceptualizing one's job. So typically it's divided into three main categories. We have task crafting, which is about changing the order in which one does a task, or the efficiency in which someone completes a task, or just kind of the actual real gritty way that it's completed. Relational crafting is all about interpersonal relationships. So that could be with other coworkers, that could be with your boss, with clients, any sort of human-to-human interaction. And then we have cognitive crafting, which is kind of changing your mindset around what your position at your job entails, or even engaging in sort of mindfulness tactics to switch your perception on how you approach your work and how you approach your day-to-day experience at your job. So the purpose of this study that we're about to explain to you is to test this job crafting intervention on people with disabilities and sort of see what happens.
Right. So as Abby just suggested in talking about the purpose of our study, it's really intended to be exploratory. So we're looking at how crafting behaviors among people with disabilities, like how they experience the crafting experience, as well as how that impacts their job performance and their sense of self-efficacy. The overarching goal for the study is to understand more about how people with disabilities experience job crafting. What about the approach works or doesn't work as a career development mechanism for people with disabilities? In the presentation today, we're going to walk you through the intervention that our participants completed, and we'll also be discussing their experiences with the process. So the research questions that we'll address include: in what ways do people with disabilities craft their jobs? Are they more likely to use task versus relational or cognitive crafting as compared to the general population? Also, how successful were participants in using job crafting, and in what ways did this process benefit them? And finally, what helped or hindered our participants in attaining their goals? So we used both quantitative and qualitative methods in the study for our data collection. Participants were recruited through a range of approaches, including word of mouth. We did some targeted outreach to agencies serving people with disabilities, as well as had assistance from professional clinical recruitment services. We used a broad operational definition of disability to include really anyone that was experiencing a chronic or health condition that impacted their ability to work. We also used a purposive sampling approach to include about 80 participants total with that were balanced across a range of different types of disabilities. To be eligible, people had to be working at least 10 hours a week, and also we looked for them to express a desire to change something about their work situation. Also, we included participants with mild cognitive disorders, so long as that did not impact their ability to consent. So our participants typically were screened for eligibility and consented to participate by completing an online form. If they were screened into the study, they were then sent a link to another survey that included demographic and background questions, as well as items from a set of standardized instruments. These included one looking at self-efficacy, work engagement, organizational citizenship, plus job crafting and job content questionnaires. A member of the research team then contacted eligible participants to schedule an interview where we asked them more questions about their work situation and alignment to their skills and interests. Once that interview was complete, participants were asked to complete a web-based job crafting exercise. We asked them to share the results from that with us, and we used that tool along with what they shared through the interview to develop a set of goals and related action steps that we shared with the participant for their feedback. Once they confirmed their goals, we entered them into a survey platform and asked the participant to work towards their goals over the next 5 weeks. At the end of each week, they received a goal progress survey to update us on their progress towards their goals. And at the end of the 6th week, they were sent a final survey of standardized and open-ended items.
Great. So here's some basic demographic information from our study. Age-wise, we had a pretty good range, more women than men. Race-wise, definitely skewed a bit white, but we had a variety of people who were mixed race, Asian and Black. Education-wise, decent spread among people with or without college degrees. And then, as Kristen mentioned earlier, we recruited participants who were working at least 10 hours, and we had a decent spread of people who were working either part-time or full-time. And then job industry-wise, it was great. We got a pretty big, wide variety of people from different industries, which was really good for us to test how this intervention affected people in all sorts of different work circumstances. So disability-wise, a lot of participants had chronic pain, nearly half. Almost a quarter had arthritis. About 12% struggled with a vision impairment or blindness. 12% had MS, and 10% had ADD and ADHD. And of course, there were certainly some comorbidities as well. So sometimes individuals struggled with one or more of these conditions. So as Kristen mentioned earlier, to sort of kick off the study, we hopped on Zoom or the phone with participants to really understand what their job entailed, what their experience was like day to day at work. And of course, people shared a lot of aspects of their job that they found challenging. So we have some participant stories up here, some quotes that were said during those initial interviews. The one in the green is from a woman who um, was working in customer service, and she struggled with social anxiety and PTSD, and she got extremely frustrated when she was and kind of overwhelmed when she was fielding lots of questions from people calling in who she said were giving her attitude. The quote in gray is from a woman who worked giving out food samples at a specialty grocery store, and her schedule was never really set in stone, so it caused quite a bit of anxiety for her. She said she would, wake up in the middle of the night and be very disoriented in terms of what her schedule was and even what day it was. Again, this quote in pink is from someone else working in customer service, and saying that by the time they finally get on the phone with her, they are just about ready to choke someone. So just kind of expressing how much frustration she absorbs from people who call in. And the quote in that periwinkle color is from a woman who worked at a nonprofit that helped transgender folks gain employment. And the organization was really run off of volunteers, but it was quite hard to find volunteers who would stay a while. So that retention piece caused some stress in her experience at work. So after this initial interview where we, unpacked what participants did for work and what their experience was on the job, we sent them to a website with a workbook where they sort of further fleshed out how they spend their time, how they would maybe like to spend their time versus how they're actually spending their time. And there was also a place for participants to start kind of writing some things that they'd like to work on within their job, within their position, or within their career at large. So this little graphic here is from the intro video that participants would watch to sort of introduce them to what this workbook entailed and what they were about to be asked to do.
Okay, so here we're showing a slide example of a goal plan that a participant was sent after working through their online job crafting exercise. Participants would typically have 3 or 4 goals. Here we've just truncated the view to show 2 goals just to improve the visibility. But in assisting participants in developing their goals, we use 2 tools. First, goals would be articulated following the SMART format. So they'd be designed to be specific, excuse me, referring to specific actions that the participant could take, measurable. They should be attainable, so something that the participant is capable of accomplishing, realistic within the scope of the participant's current job duties, and timely, so something that could be completed within the 6-week time frame. Next, the goal attainment scale was used to break goals into measurable and actionable steps that we could use to track participants' progress. The expected or most likely outcome under normal circumstances for each goal would be set as the midpoint of the scale, and relative importance and difficulty of each goal would also be taken into account. So we're continuing to conduct analysis on all of the various sources of data that we've collected. Today we're focusing on analysis of outcomes related to goal development and achievement, and also looking at the various qualitative data that we collected through the interview and weekly surveys. First, we conducted a content analysis of all the goals from the 41 participants in this sample to classify those goals as involving task, relational, or cognitive crafting, or a combination of those 3. We then analyzed their goal progress through their goal progress updates to look at trends over time and participants' reported progress over the intervention period. And finally, we used a few different qualitative approaches to data analysis, including narrative review. We did some word sorting and thematic analysis of survey responses to look at participants' experience working towards their goals and their reflections about what helped or hindered them in achieving their goals, what they learned through the process of job crafting, and what would help them to continue using this job crafting in the future.
So here we have some examples of goals and also the type of crafting that they entailed. What you can see here, which is interesting, is that some goals actually crossed categories. So we had some interesting conversations when we were doing the analysis of whether or not we should tag some goals with two types of crafting or just keep it to one. And we ultimately decided that there are certainly some goals that that span a couple categories. So for instance, we have find a more effective way of communicating with management to secure desired schedules. So of course there's a relational element there because there's that communication piece, but there's also that task part too, because this individual wanted to change the way that they completed their job and how the sort of the pace of their day was. So you can see that there's a couple other that spanned categories as well, and we thought that was interesting that sometimes that we had that sort of dual approach.
Okay, so now turning to the results related to our first research question, looking at the goals that participants set for themselves, about 58% of their goals involved task crafting or changes that they made or intended to make to job processes, such as methods for organizing their tasks, different approaches to doing tasks, time management strategies, or skills development. Then about a third of goals involved relational crafting or efforts to establish or improve interactions with colleagues or clients. Another 9% of goals involved cognitive crafting, so efforts to modify the way that the participant thought about a task or their job performance, such as practicing mindfulness strategies to reduce anxiety over job performance would be one example of this type of crafting. Now, in also sticking with our first research question, we asked participants to provide an example of what they had learned about re-envisioning their job through this process. And in response to this question, participants really described a variety of ways that job crafting had helped them. The next few slides, we're going to be showcasing 5 main themes that emerged from those responses. So about 20% of participants described ways in which job crafting had helped them to become more aware of the importance of their role in the workplace. It sort of strengthened their sense of purpose or helped them to feel more empowered to seek out ways to bring their skills and interests to bear in their work. Another 22% wrote about becoming more intentional in practicing self-care and recognizing the importance of their mental health. So taking a holistic approach to improving themselves and by extension their work lives. We also about third of participants wrote about thinking more deeply about their job and their workplace itself through a process one participant described as envisioning a wider scope and long-term planning, so a process to identify ways that the functioning of the workplace itself could be improved. And finally, another 22% commented on ways that they had improved interactions with their colleagues and their clients, and through these stronger relationships had improved their workplace productivity. And finally, the last category, the largest group, about half of participants described improved work performance through implementing more effective approaches to accomplishing tasks through better time management or improved communications strategies or acquiring new skills. So a final set of quotes, and I'm hoping that you can have a chance to kind of read through these as I describe what the quotes are referring to. But in a second question that we asked participants, we asked them if they intended to use job crafting as a process to continue to shape their job in the future. And about 3/4 of our participants responded affirmatively to this question. They described a range of different ways that they intended to use job crafting in the future, including continuing to work on the goals they had set in this study, or continuing new practices that they had learned, such as mindfulness, applying job crafting strategies to seeking future jobs, or applying the strategies they learned to other aspects of their lives.
So we also looked at that attainment scale to see how participants fared in attaining their goals. So if you remember from earlier when Kristen presented that goal worksheet, we had a current level, which was where participants were at, and then somewhat worse than expected, which we're calling -1, as expected is 0, somewhat better was +1, and then much better was +2. So as you can see from this chart here, of course, participants started -2. There was a bump around week 2, which was interesting, a little bit of a dip, and then a bump beyond that initial bump. So I believe this is, kind of in line with what research says around creating new habits. So it's interesting to see that mapped out here, that participants sort of had this early surge, fell off a little bit, and then actually did better than that initial behavior change. So here, what we did is we used this AI word cloud analysis tool to sort of see how participants were talking about what helped with their process. So you can see that coworkers came up pretty big, so that kind of relational aspect, time, of course, having a low call volume. We spoke about how there were a couple participants really stressed about working in customer service. Supervisor, so again, that sort of relational element. Boss, having a break, of course, was really key. And then we also did the same thing with what hindered people's process. So as you can see here, it's interesting that time comes up once again. So time can be sort of, someone's greatest ally or enemy in a sense, because that also was something that was difficult for participants. So we have time, lack of time, week, which is kind of also related to time management. Coronavirus, of course, came up, so that could be a whole nother presentation of how that affected our research. We have client, poor staffing, so that's another kind of relational element. Social media, lack of knowledge. So just it was interesting for us to see kind of how participants were talking about what helped them and what sort of made things more difficult. So what did we learn from this? In general, we found that people with disabilities craft less than people without disabilities, but something that I thought was really interesting is that there's actually more cognitive crafting that happens. And so that's that kind of crafting that's about your perception of your role, or engaging in something like mindfulness, or some kind of like CBT type stuff to kind of change your perspective of how you're approaching your work. We did find that people with disabilities might benefit from coaching or facilitation through this process, in part just because those sessions really increase awareness about one's job. So even just that initial interview where someone is given the time and space to discuss their job really helps someone kind of take a step back and look at what it is that they were, that their job entailed. Another interesting finding was that goals were often both disability related and non-disability related. So sometimes, participants would have goals about reducing chronic pain and taking stretch breaks, but then sometimes the goals were just simply about, communication with a coworker or reorganizing one's day or something like that, that had nothing to do with disability or work limitation. And, in general, we did find that participants really did feel reinvigorated by reimagining and sort of redrawing the boundaries of their job tasks. So that was really great to see. Of course, there were some limitations. It was a small sample size and a short duration. But, we do think that job crafting is a low cost and effective employee-directed intervention. And that was really exciting to see. So this is a public health conference, of course, so we decided to kind of open the floor for some discussion around how this might relate to public health. So we have some thought starters up here, and we welcome any questions in terms of how this process might relate more broadly to public health.
Thank you both so much. And if you want to, pose your answers to these questions using the Ask feature, please feel free, as well as putting in any additional questions for Abby and Kristen. I have to admit, I'd never actually heard the term job crafting prior to reading your abstract submission. So this has been really helpful and enlightening. And you kind of ask it in these questions, but if people are interested in using job crafting with their employees, how might they go about doing that, and what's the best way to get this term out there in the practice as well?
I can't see if there's any questions, but I can start sort of rambling if that sparks anyone's minds. So, of course, as everyone's aware of, the world is rapidly changing. It rapidly has changed, right? So some discussions that we've been having sort of like offline as a research team is how can this process of job crafting help people when we're in sort of a time of tumult. So a lot of people are needing to, or a lot of people are working from home, first of all. A lot of people are needing to maybe decide, am I going to make a career pivot? If certain industries have been sort of wiped out. So there's some bigger picture sort of questions there. And of course, in my mind, I think work always relates to public health just because it's such a big part of our lives. So it inevitably affects population health. So that's some of what we've been discussing. If anyone has any thoughts on that.
One comment that we have back so far is that really anyone applying for a job could benefit from the use of job crafting.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. We thought, and we talked about the potential for people kind of re-entering the workforce as a result of various previous experiences. People re-entering after experiencing substance use disorders or injuries, such as what we were looking at. Also, as if people had taken time out of their workplace for parenting or looking for a career change, that this would be a useful process for people experiencing lots of different changes in their work life. We also talked about how, in particular, I think Abby might have referred to this, how it now, with the kind of post-COVID work shifts that are occurring, that this has like even risen to even more importance for a wider range of people that are looking to kind of pivot the work that they're already doing in response to different work conditions.
And do you all partner, like have plans for partnering with organizations on using job crafting more or employers?
I don't believe so yet. That's an interesting idea. Kristen, do you? I don't think so. I don't think we've directly spoken about that, but you might know more.
There have been some kind of tentative partnerships where with other researchers that are also doing related work have reached out to us and so there's been some talk about collaborative efforts. Our next phase with the research that we're doing is that we've been developing a tool, our own tool for people to be able to use in walking through the job crafting process. It would be another web-based tools. The one that we've been working with is people would have to pay to be able to use this tool. We've been paying for our access to it, but we're looking at a tool that's more customized to people with disabilities that would be available to the public, and they'd be able to use that. So we're in the process of developing that. platform right now, and using the research that we're continuing to do to kind of tweak the platform and make it as beneficial as possible. So hopefully that work will, we'll have something that could be rolled out to the general public fairly soon with that.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And someone put up a comment that they could see job crafting as a necessary element of adjusting to remote work or increasing their effectiveness of working remotely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And for, for the population that we're looking at specifically, accommodations that maybe were in place in the workplace for people with disabilities, of course, when they come home, they've kind of had to go back to the drawing board with those. So we heard that kind of feedback from people that they were, kind of experiencing like a bump up in the symptoms that they had, and we're trying to now redesign the way that they were working to accommodate again.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And again, just learning about this concept and thinking about how we can apply it to our own jobs and specifically to people with disabilities is really helpful. And I think a good way of thinking how we work individually. So it is 12:30, so I hate to be the one to end the discussion, but that's part of my job. So thank you, Abby and Kristen, so much for being here today. We really appreciate the presentation and all the additional learning. A plug again to please complete the evaluation. And just as a reminder, this is our last session already somehow for today, but we will be back again tomorrow starting at 11 a.m. with a panel presentation on getting more healthy local food to SNAP recipients. So thank you everyone for attending today's sessions. And again to Abby and Kristen for being with us as two of our presenters.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.